Alrighty, good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to the California African American Museum. My name is Alexandra Mitchell, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at CAM. If you're a returning guest, and if you receive our monthly newsletter, you've likely seen or read that tonight, in our month's newsletter, that there are a few special changes happening here in our building. We recently celebrated the closing of Because I Am That, which is still partly installed behind me on these colorful walls here. Our most recent exhibition is here in the atrium, and we're excited for the much-needed upgrades that our building is undergoing currently as we look forward to reopening entirely with a new suite of very exciting exhibitions in August. So over the next couple of months, we'll be having some outdoor programming. Just next month, we'll be having a farmer's market for Juneteenth with Prosperity Market on the 18th. So we hope to see you for that, which will start with yoga and a sound bath in the morning. Are you having trouble hearing? Everybody's having trouble hearing? Okay, can we just up the mic a little bit, I guess? Thank you. Excuse me. Okay, so with that, we, of course, welcome you. We look forward to welcoming you back to our galleries very soon. But of course, for tonight, we're very excited to welcome back our dear friends and partners at PEN America for tonight's program, Earthly Delights, History, Race, and Environmental Consciousness, featuring award-winning poet Camille T. Dungy and Leah Thomas, author and founder of the nonprofit Intersectional Environmentalist. To share more about tonight's program and panelists, I'd like to welcome Louise Steinman.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to serve as one of the co-curators of this year's PEN World Voices Festival. The PEN World Voices Festival was founded in 2004 by Salman Rushdie, Michael Roberts, and Esther Allen, and it's PEN America's celebration of international language and literature. It honors our organization's 100-year history of uniting writers and readers to celebrate creative expression and the freedom to write for all. The festival was actually founded in the wake of 9/11 to counter U.S. isolationism and broaden the channels of dialogue between the United States and the world. And it was always my favorite festival to go to in New York, and it's really thrilling that the festival has now landed also for the last 5 years here in LA. It's a great honor to bring that festival to Los Angeles. So there are 5 featured events in Los Angeles over the course of these 4 days. 4 days of celebration, dialogue, and cultural exchange. We opened last night at the Skirball Cultural Center, and in addition to tonight, we will be at the UCLA James Bridges Theater tomorrow and Saturday at the Downtown Central Library and the Huntington Library and Gardens, and all of the events are free. Please check out our member table. We're a member-driven organization with chapters all over the country, and we want to thank our members and our presenting sponsors, the California African American Museum, and our great bookstore partner, Reparations Club, for helping us to share our authors' work with us tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce today's event, Earthly Delights, History, Race, and Environmental Consciousness, which will explore the ways in which literature, environmental action, history, and culture intersect. And I think when I've been reading Camille's book, you just want to take a trowel and get in your garden and dig in the ground. It's so beautiful. This book, Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden. And a few months ago, when we asked Camille who would be her first choice for a conversation partner here in LA, she said, Leah Price. I really want to talk to Leah. So it's going to be a great joy to hear the two of them in conversation tonight. I believe we're going to start tonight with a reading by Camille, after which she'll be joined by Leah. So please welcome Camille Dungy.
I did that like I was trying to show off my boots or something. How is everybody? It's nice to be back in Southern California. I'm just going to read a little taste of Soil. When we moved into our house, the covenant for our homeowners association specified that the yard should be well maintained. In those early years, a woman walked around the neighborhood with a ruler, measuring too tall grass and what she considered unwieldy or weedy vegetation, reporting homeowners to the HOA board for review and possible censure. Once, we left a compost bin where it could be seen from the sidewalk. The HOA fined us $25 a day until we concealed our bin more thoroughly. A $25 fine might not sound like a lot, but in just a month, such a penalty could add up to $775. Banish the tall grasses, banish the milkweed, banish the front yard onion patch, the failing squash and melon trials. A well-maintained lot should have fewer rangy wildflowers or none. Certainly no gangly vegetable stalks. In 2012, the year before we moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, city officials in Tulsa, Oklahoma bulldozed nearly everything a Black woman named Denise Morrison grew in her front yard after someone reported her garden full of edible and medicinal plants for violating zoning ordinances. When Morrison contested the desecration, the word there is destruction, but still, this was a desecration. When Morrison contested the destruction, a federal court refused to hear her case. She had no recourse to recoup her losses. Rather than leave the dried stalks and seed heads on our sunflowers for birds to perch on and munch as they stock up for winter, stories like Morrison's urge me to pull all remnants of summer plants out of the ground. Keep nothing brown around the house, nothing aesthetically unsavory. My family is the only Black family on our block. In fact, we are one of the few Black families in our entire town, the fourth largest city in the state of Colorado. By few, I mean that only 1.5% of people in this city, of nearly 170,000, identify in U.S. Census records as African American. By few, I mean that any time my husband Ray heads out on the bike trails, someone recognizes him by name. Callie is the only Black girl with 2 Black parents in her 440-student elementary school. This might help to clarify my resistance to the kind of suburban American monoculture that the woman in my neighborhood tried to promote via the HOA's yard maintenance code. A culture that, through laws and customs that amount to toxic actions and culturally constructed weeding, effectively maintain homogeneous spaces around America's homes. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm just so excited to be here today because of you. You are just the coolest person in the world. So I think we need to give one more round of applause for the not one, not two, many books. And to kick off our conversation, I think what really inspires me about the work that you do, it's kind of a recontextualization of environmental history. Because I remember when I was studying environmental science and I stumbled across your book, Black Nature, it just made so much sense and filled in so many gaps. and it made it really apparent that Black history is environmental history, even though it's often left out of mainstream books, narratives, etc. So why is that recontextualization really important to your work? Because it makes people like me in the environmental field feel very seen and heard and validated.
So Leah's mentioning an anthology that I created and edited and published in 2009. And it was the first anthology to collect the work of African American environmentally conscious poets. When I did the literature review I needed to do to support the fact that such a book needed to exist in the world, I was living in the Bay Area. I went to Stanford Library and Berkeley Library. I traveled to a really couple of key poetry libraries on the East Coast. I did really substantial research and found in all that substantial research and all the major canonical anthologies of environmental and nature writing and a lot of the key journals, 6 poems by Black poets. But my own computer had a whole lot more of just poems that I'm like, I like this poem. I'm trying to figure out how it's built, and I'm going to type it myself into my computer. I had like 45 in that file, right? So what was going on that this canon was so actively excluding Black poets from the idea of what nature, poetry, and environmental writing could be? And the answer was, sometimes Black poets just wander outside and look at the garden or the mountain and say, that's beautiful, that's it, that's enough, that's all I'm going to talk about. But usually, Black writers also say, and isn't it a relief to be out here feeling this joy because yesterday that thing happened in my community that terrified me, or because something about history, or also, by the way, I'm worried about my daughter's future, right? So these Black writers were also writing about social issues, cultural issues, historical, economic, racialized violence, all of these other things alongside. So in the same way in that reading that I just gave you, oh, we've got this house and we're gonna create this lawn that's full of native plants and low water plantings that are beneficial to local pollinators, etc. And it's kind of interesting that I'm doing that as the only Black person in this town. And I'm gonna leave up these brown stalks all winter long, and some people are gonna be like, why do things look like that? That's important to me for a couple of reasons. One is that this represents the way I think many of us live and think and survive in the world, through an integrated, intersectional conception of ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. And I want to make a space in the world of literature that we value for that kind of intersectional, connected thinking. I also think it's crucial, as I know you think it's crucial, that this kind of integrated thinking that allows us to consider questions of society and questions of economics and questions of hierarchies of value at the same time that we consider pleasure and beauty and joy, makes it more possible to make the necessary changes in our actions that we need to make to create a sustainable future.
So the term environmentalist is so long, and I don't know, I never really thought that I was an environmentalist until I formally started studying environmental science and policy. And honestly, that wasn't really even by choice. My mom just had this dream that she wanted me to be a doctor. So I told her, hey, here's a bachelor in science, maybe I can be a doctor, and kind of like fooled her. And I ended up falling in love with it. And when I started learning about environmentalism, I immediately thought of my grandmother, Janice, who is the quirkiest of quirky person in Missouri and has this beautiful garden in East St. Louis, and for all of my life has been reusing plastic bags, tending to her garden in ways that are dang near organic, but she would never call it that. And when I thought of an environmentalist, I started to see my grandmother, my great-grandmother that I feel so grateful to know, and so many generations of Black women in my life. So now I've been trying to reclaim that term for myself because it's just, I see it all around me now that my eyes are open to it. So for you, when was the aha moment that you were kind of an environmentalist?
Well, it ends up not being a particularly easy question for me to answer. In Soil, I do a lot of thinking through why that started, where it came from, what about my own family's history and heritage. I have a great-grandfather who was a farm demonstration agent in Louisiana in the, really a while ago, let's just say, early 20th century. So maybe it's just like in my genes. And interestingly, though, the stories about that great-grandfather whose job was to teach people how to better care for the land, every story I've ever heard about that great-grandfather, and I retell one of them in this book, every story I've always ever heard is directly woven in with some sort of story of racialized violence and Jim Crow and what it meant to be a Black man doing that work in Louisiana in the 19-teens, right? So from the start, my understanding of people who were doing good work for and with the land was inseparable from questions of social justice, right? I also grew up in Southern California. It's pretty here, right? And I grew up in a part of Southern California that was being developed as we moved in, right? So my backyard was undeveloped, still is, I think, actually. And then my front yard were these bulldozed, terraced streets with very human-made. And so I grew up with this sense of a wild landscape and a human landscape being both, like one out my back door, one out my front door, being connected. I didn't believe, and I think many of us who have like the ability to see these mountains or to access the ocean here, that sense that the grandeur of nature has to be something far, far away for you to access it, I didn't think that that had to be the case. So in writing Soil, one of the things I end up having to think my way through is why still, when I say to somebody, nature writing, is the conception so frequently like some sort of John Muir situation of just some lone person wandering into the mountains just by themselves for weeks at a time? Why can't that be what happens just outside my door, right? Why can't our sense of being an environmentalist, being somebody who's engaged with nature, be the kind of thing you're describing about your grandmother? And then what does it mean that so frequently the moment we're talking about your grandmother, then that's something else, right? It's just like a kind of domestic economy that she's got. It's not a passionate care. Why is there a diminishment of daily domesticated environmental engagement in so much of our literature and also imagination of who can be who can be an environmentally conscious person. And so I'm really kind of working towards removing those barriers to access that you can think as a child, oh, I am an environmentally engaged person, right? As opposed to having to almost trick yourself into it, because the vision of who does that work has actively and often purposefully excluded you, right?
Absolutely, and I love what you said, because representation is important for so many reasons. But reading books like yours and learning about George Washington Carver, and not only peanut butter, but basically how he's the father of modern regenerative agriculture, even when I was showing up in environmental science classrooms or spaces with people who didn't look like me, being able to recall those people made me walk into those spaces with a sense of confidence. And I want every Black child to be able to show up in a science setting and say, I belong here. So that's why these stories are so important, and I think can motivate a new generation of people to become environmentalists.
Because Black joy in the outdoors is deeply important, right? Those stories of joy and connection and inheritance and love are deeply important. I think that one of the superpowers of many people of color is, in fact, our ability to hold joy with grief, right? To hold joy with fear, to understand that I can be looking at something that's beautiful and wonderful and still be engaged with and knowledgeable about the histories of these spaces and the brutalities that are going on all around us. That's a capaciousness of imagination that is exciting to me, and that is dismissed if only one type of person has been given the sort of microphone to be the spokesperson for environmental thought and engagement.
Absolutely, and what you said made me think of the concept of radical imagination. Has anyone heard of that? It makes me feel really sparkly. There's someone who came to an Earth Sessions. I see you. So radical imagination is essentially, in movement spaces, being able to imagine the world that you want to see, because oftentimes we get so caught up in the systems that we want to dismantle, and that's what my book is called. I need to write a follow-up. But we become really familiar with the systems we want to dismantle, environmental injustice, and the injustices that we face, which is incredibly important. But a couple years ago, if you were to ask me, what is the world that I want to see and how do we build it, I wouldn't know how to answer it. And a lot of people in the movement spaces I was in didn't know how to answer it. And not being able to answer that question can lead to so much burnout. So I've been trying to shift the focus of my work to incorporate joy, incorporate hope, because that's what I feel like our ancestors have taught us. We have a history of resilience, and to make time to radically imagine what that future looks like. One where there's clean air, clean water, and it's not just a right for a select few, but for all people. So yeah, I want you all to radically imagine after today and remember that joy can and should be at the center of your activism. And different segue, but the publishing industry is very white and very male. And I felt incredibly privileged and scared to write my first book at 25 years old. And I felt a tremendous amount of responsibility to include as many voices of people who came before me or were doing this work in the present, to make sure that we were able to amplify other voices. And I feel like that's something that you do with your work. But any thoughts on the state of the publishing industry and sometimes the pressure it might put on Black women authors who finally get that shot to have their work published?
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things is like, this is a book-length narrative, soil, because so many of these ideas are, they're big, and so with this book-length narrative, I was able to return and kind of move a little bit towards things and come back again and again as my own thinking grew and shifted and changed, like the plants in a garden go through cycles. So bear with me as sometimes my answers feel a little bit long in speaking because I'm trying to pull together like a book's worth of thinking about these things. Early in Soil, in the first couple pages, I'm on a tour with my real estate agent through town, and at the end of this tour, she asked me, "Where do you think it is you want to live?" Which was a practical question because she just wants to sell me a house, but I found it to be a real, like, metaphysical question, right? Like that. How do I want to be the change I want to see in the world? Where is it that I want to create change? And one of the places in the creation of this book, I decided I wanted to live in a place that valued community, that valued engagement, and didn't live in that sense of a solitary genius who just creates things whole cloth out of her amazing brain all by herself. And so throughout the book, much like you do in Intersectional Environmentalist, I name check people who have been models and guides to me, mentors in positive ways, sometimes mentors in ways that I learned how to not do things that way, right? That's another kind of mentorship. And if you learn how to digest that kind of mentorship, it can be really beneficial without destroying you, right? It's work to figure that out, but that's important too. I name other writers whose work I have engaged with through time. I name family members. I speak into history, and I call those names forward. And I also worked in community with people around me. My daughter shows up in this book. In the audio version of the book, there's actually a little sound clip of her singing a song with me that we have in the book. And her visual art is in this book in connection with another photographer who came to the house to shoot images, and we sent those images to a photographic visual artist who made these photograms from clippings of the garden and plants, and I wanted all those women's hands visually, actively inside this book so that we can see the power of what it means to come together to make this diverse, sustainable landscape, as opposed to what it means for me to try and do it on my own. I tell a story of trying to do like a pretty major renovation of the garden, which required a delivery of a lot of dirt, like a lot. And I hadn't consulted anybody else. I just was like, today's the day, I want the soil. Just let's get it. And it turned out to be like the windiest day of the year, and it was supposed to snow, which meant that the plows were gonna come. I was gonna lose like money. Like there was true things at stake for my having thought that I could just do this without just talking to my community about when the best time was and how best to do this. And I learned my lesson from there. And I understand, like, there's a way. You said I was 25 years old and I worried about, what I hear there is I worried about being kind of smart enough and strong enough and having the authority to tell this story. But I actually read that in your book as like this glorious thing. Like, look at this. This thinker values the messages and the work and the intelligence that has already existed and is already going on, and is saving yourself the energy of having to repeat what other people have said in really smart ways, and using that energy to move forward that message, right? So your question about the publishing industry, for me, it became a matter of finding that community within the publishing industry who would be able to see me where I was, move me further, challenge me. I ended up at Simon & Schuster with a editor named Yadon Israel, who also, as Leah has done, has like really brilliantly figured out how to use social media as part of his ways of promoting books. And so, like, using new technologies and new kinds of interfaces in fantastic ways, but also he just pushed me to trust that my loving community was out there, and trust that because my loving community was out there, I could say the truth, the hard truths, the difficult truths, like I could bear myself in ways, and trust that if I fell, y'all would catch me, right? And not every editor or publishing house has that kind of real challenge, like being willing to challenge their writers, but also know that they're challenging out of a place of love. And I made some decisions in the process of choosing where to place this book that had to do with wanting that, right? Wanting that kind of forceful embrace.
And I love what you said, because honestly, there's nothing new under the sun. That's what my grandma always tells me. And I feel like you have very little to lose and everything to gain from collaborating with people and from learning from them and acknowledging them and building community with them. So I think, do we have time for one more question before Q&A? Okay, yay. I have two questions. So who are some of the people who have inspired you on this journey? And then secondly, what piece of advice would you give to your younger self, knowing what you know now?
That's a great question. One of the questions that I continually interrogate inside Soil is why mothers, particularly people who are raising children, are so frequently erased from the canonical environmental literature. It's like, that's like the most mammalian I ever felt was in the early years with my child. It's like there's a wildness that my child gave me access to, a way of seeing the world differently. And yet, in a really significant portion of the 19th and 20th century foundational environmental texts, it's like the people who raise children don't exist. Even though a lot of those people who wrote the books actually had children. They just, that was gone. And I was like, what? To me, for one thing, it was just an inspiration. It was just a really fascinating thing. I wrote a lot of this book during 2020, where I was homeschooling my daughter during the pandemic, and watching her learn about the history of the American West was fascinating and instructive, right? I learned a lot about why I think the way I think, because I was watching the indoctrination process at work. And I was watching what showed up and what didn't show up, and who showed up and who didn't show up. And so one answer that I have for that question, which is a little bit not that kind of answer I think people usually give, one answer to that question is my inspiration has been my daughter, because seeing her intelligence and seeing her kind of figure out how to make sense of the world has made me want to build a world that makes sense, right, for her. I also am really thinking about family, but like when I'm talking about family, I'm really actually talking about community. I'm talking about those most intimate connections that we have and the kinds of concessions we have to make and benefits that we get from living in close proximity with other people and other living beings in a way that's like conscious and open and paying attention to the needs of all these individuals. And so that to me became really important. I didn't want to write my family out. I wanted to figure out how to describe our conversations, how to describe my mother's body language as she's doing dishes, right? The sort of little details of what happens inside my home became for me a way to understand this big home that is our planet differently, and I think sometimes more effectively. One of the writers about whom I write in this book is a writer named Ann Spencer, who lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, which happens to be the town where my mother was born. And she called herself a colored woman. So we would call her a mixed race person at this point. Black woman who lived in this town in this one house for 70 plus years, growing this incredible garden, writing poems, founding the NAACP, creating a library for the black people in town, because that town's library was segregated by the deed of the building. In order to actually desegregate the public library in Lynchburg, Virginia, they had to build an entirely new building because the deed in the building said that black people couldn't use that building. So Ann Spencer created her building. She was this woman who did all these things: social activism, mothering. She had 3 children, a really beautiful relationship with her husband, gardening, and writing. And so she became I think I really came to know Ann Spencer deeply when I was about 25. So she became this really important figure to me as a model of what could be also in that really, again, like deeply integrated kind of intersectional way.
And I think we have time for audience Q&A.
Yay!
Yay! I love this part. So if anyone has any questions about anything, well, like within reason, please ask away. Oh, I see one.
Hello?
Also, hi.
So I'm wondering, there's sort of a leap of faith that has to happen with creative people, especially when we use like our creative skill set, whatever medium it is, towards causes that we truly care about. So I'm interested to hear about both of your stories or experiences to when you realized you had that capability and confidence to use your creativity towards creating a better future.
I guess I can start. I still feel like I'm doing that every day, and I think probably the scariest moment for me was during the summer of 2020. I was working at my dream company, Patagonia, and then I was furloughed during the pandemic, and then they asked me to come back in a new diversity job. And I started thinking about it, like I could transform my dream company, or I can actually just create my dream organization and maybe write a book. And it was really scary. I was on unemployment. I was paying people on Venmo and PayPal and doing like soap ads on Instagram to fund the start of Intersectional Environmentalist. And I was so scared. I didn't know what I was doing. I remember a ton of people were like, "You're gonna lose your Patagonia laptop. Like, what are you doing?" And it was so scary, but it was so worth it because I really just felt it in my heart that it's something that I needed to do. And there's been so many wins along the way, but probably just as many failures along the way. And I feel like those have been my greatest teachers. And then recently, as you've been to, we launched Earth Sessions, which are these climate justice concerts. And a lot of people thought I was just losing my mind because first I want to write books and reshape curriculums, and then I had to convince people, no, like concerts can be a vehicle for environmental education. And it was really scary. We're still figuring it out, but I feel like after that first leap in 2020, it made me so much more confident every time after, and then I felt really comfortable with failure because it's been my greatest teacher.
Yay. I just have to say, you to me, you're like, just like, I love you, and I like so much.
You too.
And I remember like those early years, like being on Instagram, being like, who is this person? My like heart sister. This is so exciting. So I've been just really excited to watch as everything keeps growing and blooming, and that like, I feel like what you're saying is like you follow the fertile path, you follow what needs to be planted, and you plant it well and right, and it will grow, right? The garden for me serves as a metaphor for that kind of work. Gardens only grow in fertile soil, but what fertile soil is and can be can vary. I mean, I grew up in Southern California where you can just like, it's like Eden here, you know, you just like throw out seeds and things grow. It's like blah. But now I live in northern Colorado where there will be a snow the week after Mother's Day. Like you don't plant anything really until after Mother's Day snow. And then there was a snow in 2020, the day after Labor Day. It's crazy. And it's like this kind of clay soil, and I had to figure out what to grow and how to grow it. And one of the things I learned, unsurprising, is that the native plants do better. They're like, oh look, it's the late May snow. I love that on my shoulders. You know, they just like kind of don't care. Nice hydration, thank you. Whereas this kind of things that are I've brought in from other places because that's what a garden is supposed to look like, they wilt and die and are like not happy. The metaphor for me with this for life and art especially is figure out what you need to grow. What does the soil of your life need? What will grow out of your life and not get destroyed when really difficult environmental conditions affect it? What can you sustain and that will feed you with like actual food or beauty? And as you learn that, and as you learn how to tend and take care of whatever it is that you're growing in your life, it will become reciprocal, and it'll keep giving you what you need to give it what it needs in a really beautiful, continual cycle.
Hello, thank you both. I was reading a book recently, and it brought up the term SoulNostalgia, which was new to me, but thinking about the mourning associated with acknowledging the climate crisis. And the term was new, but I think I'm familiar with the experience of climate grief. And the book talked about gardening as a remedy for that, as planting as a way of like really tangibly processing the grief. And I'm just curious if you both would share your experiences with climate grief and how gardening or writing or other processes have helped with processing the grief.
Yeah, the term is SoulNostalgia. There was actually an anthology that was just published recently with that title, and it's about sort of mourning what we're losing in our ecosystems, and therefore what we lose from ourselves. Gardening to me feels like an activist activity because I actually get to do work that changes things. And so when I started planting in my yard, all of a sudden birds and butterflies and insects and damselflies and dragonflies that I don't see in other places right around me started coming to my yard. So I was doing this thing to create this space of beauty and rest and, just general fulfillment, and also quite literally saving the world, right? One little, not particularly big plot of land at a time, right? There's other giant things that we need to do. We need to think about how we vote. We need to think about, like a lot of other things. But I feel like with gardening, it has helped me learn how to also do tangible, practical actions that are beneficial and also joy-inducing. So that's great, right?
And I need to probably garden a little bit more. I'm trying to get into it. But yeah, what you said is so true, especially for Gen Zers. And I want to make a map of this. So climate communications has actually been really successful at scaring people. And if you saw a graph from An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's first documentary, until now, you would see that the generations of people have gotten more depressed about the state of the future. And specifically with Gen Z, there's a study by an organization called Futera. They had to create a new category on the scale. Because while millennials, a lot of people feel pessimistic about the state of the planet and the climate crisis, more Gen Zers are identifying with climate fatalism. So they feel like there is no hope, there's nothing they can do because they've grown up where all of their lives they've seen a world on fire. And I think it's time to shift the pendulum because the kids aren't all right, but they can be all right if we give them a little bit of hope and infuse, that radical imagination. So everything that you're saying is so true, and I think that's why we need to shift environmental communications to be a little bit more optimistic. So when I talk about joy in the climate space, I've started to rethink it as a revolutionary act. Like, joy is something that these oppressive systems cannot take away from me, and I will not let take away from me. And I can look at my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and look at all of the things that they've been through, and yet my great-grandmother, who's still alive, will stand up and dance to Frankie Beverly and Maze every single time. So if she can do it, I can do it, and starting to rethink joy as a way that I practice activism and stick it to these, oppressive systems. So really hold that in your heart. Also rest. There's a great organization called the Nap Ministries that preaches that rest is also a radical act of resistance, and I think we need to reincorporate those things into our activism practices. Because the Black Panthers also taught us that. They were really passionate about rest and self-care and community care.
Yeah.
I want to thank you both so much for injecting hope and joy into this room and into this night and into this world. Our authors will be signing their books. Please know that the Penn World Voices Festival is not over. Check out the website, Penn World Voices, and join us for our other remaining events and learn about becoming a member of Penn. Thank you both, and let's give a big round of, and to our wonderful
And
interpreters.
Thanks to the interpreters.